Yeah, do we have time for questions?
Sure, go ahead.
Anybody have a question? Yes.
When I was growing up in Washington, we always call it the Mellon Gallery, not the National Gallery. Wasn't Andrew Mellon a great purchaser of this art?
So it's really hard to find out. It's easy to find out where most of these pieces are today. It's harder to track the provenance of where they were. So from what I was able to tell, my wife Barbara and I went through the catalogs and we kind of did a little searching on the internet in quarantine times, trying to go back and figure out where some of these paintings were. Many of them that are in the National Gallery in the United States are bequests from people, but I can't find any that come from Andrew Mellon's personal bequests. There are a couple of other big collectors that bought some of these, I think in New York City, and then donated them to the National Gallery later in life. So I don't know of any that Andrew Mellon, he bought these artists, but I don't think he bought any of these at this sale. At least none that I've been able to find yet. Charles Smart, I think is the man's name whose collection from this sale mostly ended up at the National Gallery. Charles something, I think it's Smart.
And then I was wondering where the Russians came in, because I know the Hermitage is full.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, the Russians only have a couple of pieces that came much, much later, because of course Russia was in the midst of a revolution.
Right.
So the Bolsheviks weren't going to be buying anything, and most of the czars were running away too. I think I counted, there's 71 countries that had or have one piece or another. The Israeli Museum has a couple, which I think the anti-Semite would have just loved. So, so they're all over the world, and they're in private collections, they're in public collections, they're all over the place. What's remarkable to me is really how few of them are in France.
Right, their heritage.
It's a small number. And most of those that are in the Musée d'Orsay or they're in small provincial museums somewhere throughout France.
When was Dr. Barnes buying all of his art? And from what I understand, does he have more Cezannes than all of Paris?
I think so, though I don't know. So there's a few Cezannes, including Keynes's here. Most of his are at the National Gallery too, right? Barnes's? Or the Barnes Collection in Philly.
Yeah.
There are a couple, I'm sorry, I misheard you. There are a few from the Barnes Collection that come from this sale as well. But whether they come direct or whether they had a couple of buyers in between, that's a lot harder to track. There is actually a French researcher that's building a database of everything Degas ever owned or painted and trying to track the provenance of each one of these. But as you can imagine, that's really, really difficult to do. I have a friend in Paris who was doing some research for me in the French National Archives, and she was going to go to the Musée d'Orsay's archives and see if they had tracked the provenance. But because of COVID, those archives aren't open, so I don't have a full answer to that. But yeah, there are a couple in the Barnes Collection. There's a couple in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh as well. There's a few of them in Pennsylvania. There's a few in Baltimore, many in DC. They're all over the place. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Japanese were interested. Could you expand upon that a little bit?
Degas was one of the earlier collectors, European collectors of Japanese prints. So there were connections between him and a bunch of Japanese buyers. What I think is true, however, ironically again for Degas' life, these were Japanese buyers who were coming to try to buy Monet's water lilies, which later went to the French government and, as some of you know, are in the Orangerie in Paris now. I think it was those buyers who happened to be in France when the Degas sale were going on and then bought a number of pieces and brought them back to Japan. So that happened almost by accident. But they were there to try to buy Monet's water lilies when he was having a conflict with the French government himself.
Could you comment further on, you're saying that Degas didn't think that artists that painted outside were serious artists?
Apparently Degas went through a period in the 1890s where he himself did do some outdoor landscapes, but then he decided that's not, a painter paints in the studio. So those notebooks that I mentioned were hand sketches that he had done. Then he would go back to his studio and then he would do the landscapes. So I remember going through, he and Monet, I don't think Monet paid very much attention to Degas, but Degas paid a lot of attention to Monet. And I remember when I was doing some of the research for this, coming across someone that went through, someone contemporary to these two artists, and said that if you went to a place that Monet had painted, you could recognize it. If you went to a place that Degas, a landscape that Degas had painted, and put it side by side to the actual image or a photograph, they wouldn't look that much alike. Because Degas would kind of take notes, this is what I wish the landscape would look like, and then he'd go paint it in his studio. So to him, it wasn't about realism, it wasn't even about an impression of the realism, it was about setting technique and all of that. So they were very different approaches to that kind of painting. And then I think in about the 1890s, after he finished those notebooks, if I'm right, Degas stopped painting landscapes altogether and switched to others, like the ballet dancers and other themes that he focused on so much. So yeah, he looked down on anybody that painted outside. Yeah.
Was Degas interested in any of the non-French artists who were active in Paris at the time? Say, Picasso comes to mind.
No, there are no Picassos in the collection. There are a couple of Mary Cassatts, as I said. Cassatts, the Japanese prints. Barbara, I don't think we came across hardly anything else, did we?
I don't remember.
It's mostly Cassatt are from the non-European collection. And those two had a very interesting relationship. She lived in the south of France, and she's the one that arranged for the daughter to come to Paris to help care for Degas' old age. And I have to say, reading Mary Cassatt's letters, she does not come off as the person that I would hope she would have been.
In what way?
She is unbelievably racist. Seems, at least later in her life, to have been quite unhappy and quite angry at almost everybody, which is just not the picture I had in my head of Mary Cassatt.
What part of the States was she from?
She's from Pittsburgh. She's from what's today the north side of Pittsburgh, what was then Allegheny City, which is now part of Pittsburgh. Speaking of which, we need an update on the game. That's right.
I've been listening.
Yes.
More a personal question. How did you get interested in the origins and transactions of artwork?
So I have a really close friend. I've always been interested in art and the way that art represents war, and war is represented in art, and what war does to artistic movements. I have a really close friend who's working on a study. John Maynard Keynes is most famous for the book. He went to the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. About halfway through, he realized this is going to be a disaster. This is going to end terribly. He quit. He moved back to that cottage that the Cezanne was in, and he wrote this incredibly damning indictment of the Paris Peace Conference, even before the thing had been signed. And he said, this is going to cause a worldwide depression, it's going to cause a second world war, here's why. This incredibly damning book. So I have a good friend who's working on a history of British finance during World War I, so he's working deeply in the Keynes papers. He lives in England, he lives not that far from where Keynes' cottage is. And during isolation, we were kind of every 2 weeks just having a kind of tea together. What are you up to? How are you dealing with quarantine? And early on in this process, he said to me, I came across this record. Did you know that Keynes was in Paris buying art while the Operation Michael was going on? I'm thinking, that sounds like an urban myth. That can't be right, And then I started looking, and I'm like, holy crap, he was there. And I just thought, how did John Maynard Keynes, of all people, end up there? And like, I work for the government. It's not easy to get money out of the government, right? So how in the middle of a war do you get the equivalent of almost $1 million to go and buy art? Like, how does that happen? And the thing that originally got me curious is all it said was the $800,000, 20,000 pounds, came from a quote-unquote special gift to the British government. And I thought, that sounds really weird. So my friend in England and I started figuring out and we finally, between the two of us, I found one set of documents, he found another set of documents, and we were able to piece together, this is how we got the money. And then I thought, okay, let's try to figure out what else is going on here. So thanks in part to Barbara's help, we started looking for stuff, and we started, just figuring out, okay, these paintings went all over the world, and there's got to be a story here. So I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Maybe write an article, maybe write a book, I don't know. But it just, the more I looked into it, the more I thought, this is insane. Like, this is crazy. Like, they're having an art sale in a gallery with a glass roof while the Germans are firing these artillery shells. This is insane. And I work, where I work at the Army War College, we had all the stuff on the Paris guns at the Army War College. So we had the French studies in 1919 and all this stuff. So I was able to research it at least from that end of, how terrifying this was. And so just the contrast of the terror of the guns and the beauty of the art. I mean, these are gorgeous.
Yeah.
The ones from the sale, especially Corot, Gauguin, Corot, these are beautiful, beautiful paintings. And you think about what's the history behind these paintings. So that's what got me first interested.
It's fascinating. It just draws to mind real quick the Titanic, that scene where they're playing as the ship is going down.
Yeah, I mean, and then for the French, it's exactly the opposite, right? We're not going down. We're going to win this, right? And we're going to do what we can to make sure that the art is a part of that victory. And then, of course, the irony, or however you want to put it, of the collection ending up much of it here in the United States.
Dispersed.
Yes, ma'am.
Did the caretaking daughter ever get any money?
She got at least half of that $40 million.
Oh, good.
So she did okay in the end. She did okay in the end. Yeah, I don't know what happened to the brother. Kind of drops off the radar. he had two brothers, one of whom drops off the radar, the other of whom ends up running the banking. So he ends up staying in the public limelight for a while. There's another hand.
I'm curious about the voting party. I know it's at the Phillips Collection.
Mhm.
Do you know the provenance of it?
No, my guess would be it came over to the United States in the 20s, which is when much of this art ends up in the United States. And then some of these paintings, the ones that we were able to track, they have 3 or 4 buyers through the years until somebody finally decides to donate it to a museum for whatever reason. That one was funny because that was the jigsaw puzzle we were working on through quarantine. So on the one hand, we're trying to figure out how these pieces go together in this very difficult jigsaw puzzle. It's not an easy puzzle. And then I'm looking for pictures of the WWII gallery because I kept seeing it described and I wanted to see what it looked like. I'm like, wait a minute, that's it. And there's the Japanese garden one from Monet. There's one of his cliffs paintings is here. And I'm sure if you spent enough time with that photograph, you could probably identify almost every piece on the wall. It's just remarkable.
That reminds me of a room in the Frick Museum.
Yeah, so the Frick has a couple of these paintings as well. And Louisine Habermeyer's mansion had a bunch, all of which ended up at the Met when she passed away.
Just any idea, it sold for $40 million, what that potentially would be today in today's dollars, or what it's worth currently today in general?
I think I was able to track, this is also difficult because that 40 million figure comes from me kind of guessing because my friend in Paris actually did find parts of the sale catalog. So I can actually tell what some of these pieces sold for. But they're in 1918 francs, which then have to be translated into US dollars. And I think eventually we figured out, me and a couple of European colleagues, that if you multiplied the francs amount by about 18, you would get roughly to US dollars today. So some of these paintings are selling for $1.2 million, some are selling for $800,000. It's a lot of money. So what I can say for sure is about $40 million. If I had to guess what the whole thing was worth, probably 60 to 70. But it's really hard. And I learned a lot about how they do these conversions too. They look for the way they calculate currency over time, the way they do it accurately, is they do it through the price of zinc. Because for some reason the sale and price of zinc over time has been the price has risen exactly with inflation. So that's the way that the professionals do it. So little things like that are fun to play around too. And the catalogs that my friend Vanda sent from Paris are beautiful to look at. They're impossible to read on a computer screen. They're difficult to read, but they're beautiful. That beautiful, gorgeous early 20th century handwriting that people had, and reproductions of the black and white photographs of some of these paintings. And it's really beautiful. I mean, someone, I assume it was WWII himself, so really took love and care to put this thing together. You can feel that it's a labor of his love. And he also knew he was going to make a lot of money himself off of it. And the American media covered the 1921 sale, which is very interesting. The American coverage of that.
So this is totally unrelated to the art, but did they ever get the gun, a Paris gun?
Yeah, so what happened was the thing was so big that obviously it's very difficult to move. So they had 3 of them. One of them blew up while the Germans were operating it, killing about 18 of their own guys. So they dismantled that one. The other 2, as the Allied armies were approaching, they dismantled them and tried to hide them in the forest, and then the soldiers run away. The Americans then got to the guns and melted the metal down after the war to do something else with. There's a World War II version of this that the Germans used in Italy in World War II. The gun is called Anzio Annie, and it was at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for a long time. And they moved it now to wherever the Army's Artillery Museum is, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, I think. So they melted it down is the answer for the World War I ones. But there is a World War II example on the same model that you can go and visit if you're ever at Fort Sill.
Thank you.
I think it's in Fort Sill. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just interested about your being at the Army War College. Do you teach these wonderful colonels this kind of thing?
No, we don't talk about that at all. No. Most of what I teach is history and international relations theory. We also have specialists in organizational behavior and leadership and management and things like that. But I teach history, but to me, what's important about this is the way that strategy and the way that societies think about themselves in war is interesting to me. The way societies get into wars and the way they get out of wars is really interesting to me. So another angle of this that's so interesting to me is that this is happening at the end of a war. They don't know it's the end of the war yet, but as this is going on, they can begin to see it kind of coming into focus. But no, I don't think we've had any discussions of Degas and Cezanne at the Army War
I
College.
couldn't quite see what you were doing, but I thought you certainly know a lot about this.
Well, I mean, one of these days it'd be fun to give a lecture to my students and see what they made of it.
I think they'd love it.
Yeah, I think they probably would enjoy it too, because it's a different way to think about the problems that they have to think about every day. And I've encouraged all of them to come here and see this exhibit because it's important. It's important.
Did this research prompt you to then go into all the art atrocities related to World War II, and did that?
Not yet. So I've been working 2 projects at once. So this one and another one, which I just got under contract. So I've been really busy nailing those 2 things down. So this lecture now done in a few minutes, and then that other project is almost done. I can start to think about some other stuff. But I've been working this one and one other. And like I said, I just don't know yet what I want to do with this one. I've had a few people say you should write a book on it, and I've had a couple other people say, I don't know if there's a book there or not. So simply because I don't know how deep the archival stuff in Paris actually is. And until I can get there to see it, it's going to be a while. It's going to be a while. Yes, sir?
I just finished reading a book, an interesting book by a British historian about World War I. And he got into an interesting discussion, because America resisted getting into the war. Woodrow Wilson really, for quite a long time, really didn't want to commit. And there were a lot of things that happened which we don't get into, like the U-boat situation and these interesting things going on with Mexico. But one can only speculate what would have happened, how would things have played out if the Americans hadn't decided to get involved.
Yeah.
Because that was really what was the beginning of the end for the Germans when the Americans showed up.
So I've got another counterfactual, as we call them, that I love to play with my students with. If the founding fathers in the late 18th century, a few miles east of here, had written into the Constitution that treaties are approved by the Senate on a majority vote, instead of 2/3, which is what they did write. If they had done that 150 years earlier, 140 years before the Civil War, the Revolution, it's entirely possible the United States joins the League of Nations and ratifies the Treaty of Versailles. There was a majority for it. There wasn't a 2/3 majority for it. So, with my students, I used to joke around. I used to say that I'll only discuss counterfactuals in a bar, not in a classroom, because in history we can't rerun the experiment and take one thing out of the experiment. So it's complicated for people like me. But there are some historians and people that I deeply, deeply respect who are doing this as a methodology with their students. So I've had to back off from my flippant line about discussing these things in bars. My guess is that it would have been very difficult for Germany to win this war regardless. And the thing that German leaders were really worried about at the end of the war was not the Americans. They were worried about a Bolshevik revolution happening inside Germany. And that's entirely likely if this war goes on another year. Germany's almost out of food, it's almost out of medicine, there's an influenza epidemic. I can envision a lot of really unpleasant things that could have happened. And that's what they're trying to avoid in going for the armistice. But yeah, the American story is a really, really complicated one that I'd be happy to talk to you about.
In a bar.
In a bar. In a bar, yes sir.
I'm interested in the agents at the auction. So the Americans were the money, a lot of money, the Brits were money behind it, but there's only one American actually there. Which means there were French agents who were doing this, what some would perceive as anti-French action of actually purchasing on behalf of Americans.
Right. Yeah, so the agents are there to make money. The couple of accounts I have from agents, that's what they're saying, right? If the Degas family wanted this to stay in France, that's what they would have done, right? They would have kept it together, they would have accepted, would have waited until the end of the war, they would have worked something out with the French government. Durand Ruel would have kept them in his gallery safely for as long as anybody needed. That's not what they chose to do, they chose to sell it. So our job is to sell it, and our job is to make money from it, and that's what the family wants. They want the money. So we're here doing what the family wants. I haven't seen anybody really come after the agents all that much. There's controversy over the government's role, simply because the government should be doing this, but it doesn't have money to do it. There's a lot of vitriol aimed at the British, and there's less aimed at the Americans because the Americans aren't really there. There's a lot of vitriol aimed at the Swedes, which I find interesting, because a lot of the Swedes were neutral in World War I, but a lot of their coal and iron ore trade is going to Germany. So the allegation is that the Swedes are making money, made their money by helping out the Germans, and now they're taking it and buying our art. So there's a lot of vitriol aimed at Sweden, which is interesting. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns? thank you for coming out on this miserably rainy day, and I appreciate your attention, even though I know it's hard to sit and listen to a lecture in a mask. Thanks very much.